coming up on The World Today. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov clarifies there's no new wave of Russian mobilization in response to social media rumor. UK's Prime Minister Liz Truss says she will not cut public spending to fund tax cuts to protect the economy. And Britain's Business Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg says economic figures are not always accurate as data shows the country's economy is on the brink of recession. And welcome to the program. I'm Millicent Walker in Lagos. It's day 231 since Russia invaded Ukraine. Here are the developments today. Now, Russia's FSB security service says it has detained 8 people in connection with Crimea's bridge explosion, which happened on Saturday. According to its security service, 5 out of the 8 detainees were Russians, while the other were Ukrainian and Americans. It adds that Kyiv was behind the attack, but a Ukrainian official described Russia's investigation as nonsense. This comes as explosions were reported in the Ukrainian cities of Kherson, Zaporizhia and Nikopol. 5 explosions have been heard on Kherson, one of the largest cities under Russian occupation, while there were unconfirmed reports that the air defense system in the city had been activated. However, it is not clear what had triggered the explosions. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has said that rhetoric from Western leaders on the potential use of nuclear weapons was harmful and provocative. According to Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, such a practice was provocative. He adds, "We express our daily regret that Western heads of state engage in nuclear rhetoric every day." He insists there had been no attempt from either side to discuss a possible meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden. Or staying with the Kremlin, it hopes that the Group of 7 would hold the Kyiv regime accountable for the crimes it has committed. The G7 nations pledged on Tuesday to continue providing financial, humanitarian, military, diplomatic and legal support to Ukraine, adding in a statement after a leader's call that any use by Russia of nuclear weapons would be met with severe consequences. In the meantime, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg has welcomed the decisions by NATO allies to provide air defense systems to Ukraine 2 days after Russian missiles rained down on cities across the country, including Kyiv. The gathering in Brussels is the first big NATO meeting since Moscow annexed several Ukrainian territories, announced the mobilization and issued veiled nuclear threats, moves that the alliance has classified as a clear escalation of the war that started the invasion of Ukraine February 24. A German Defense Ministry source said yesterday that Ukraine received the first of 4 Iris-T SLM air defense systems Germany promised to supply. Moscow, which calls its actions a special military operation to eliminate dangerous nationalists and protect Russian speakers, has accused the West of escalating the conflict by supporting Kyiv.
Good morning.
Secretary General, what is NATO's response?
I welcome that NATO allies are providing air defense systems, infrastructure destroyed, and not more air defense for Ukraine.
Good morning, Secretary General. There are still a small number of
and the message from NATO allies will be that we
response.
I welcome that NATO allies are providing air defense systems, infrastructure destroyed, and not more air defense for Ukraine.
Good morning, Secretary General. There are still a small number.
And to the update on Russia's reservists, the Kremlin has said that there was no new wave of men being drafted into the army after some regional officials reported they were stepping up mobilization efforts. Kremlin spokesperson told reporters to check with individual regional governors regarding their plans. The defense ministry said more than 200,000 were drafted in the first weeks after President Vladimir Putin announced a partial mobilization of reservists to fight in Ukraine. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu earlier suggested 300,000 men with previous military experience would be called up to bolster Russia's war efforts in Ukraine, although Putin's decree did not disclose a number. Officials from two separate regions said this week they had received new orders to mobilize troops, raising fears a second wave of men could be called up to serve in the army. The governor of Russia's Rostov region said he had received a new mobilization assignment, while the deputy head of Kursk region was quoted as saying they had been given a second mobilization target. Tens of thousands of men seeking to avoid the draft have already fled abroad, and the public remains concerned that the mobilization could be expanded. Well, let's go to our foreign affairs commentator, Confidence McCarry. He joins me now to talk more about the situation. Confidence, thank you for joining me. First, tell us, what do you make of the recent events in the war? I mean, many wonder what Putin is up to, seeing as missile strikes from Monday, yesterday was also recorded, and we're hearing striking crowded streets. I mean, is this what he still refers to as his special military operation?
Yeah, thank you for having me on again. A lot has passed since our last discussion on what Russia calls a special military operation in Ukraine, and to give an insight on where we currently are now is to acknowledge what's happened before today or before this week, the blowing up of the Kerch Bridge. That a part of the Kerch Bridge that was damaged by what the Russian FSB has been described as a terror attack by Ukrainians. The bridge which links mainland Russia with the what we now formerly known as what we formerly know as the territory of Ukraine, which is Crimea. And the Russians took that quite personally, because even before the referendum, which was hosted about a few weeks ago, that give the territories of Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the entire Donbass arena to the Russian states. They've always seen Crimea as part of their legitimate territory. So any kind of attack on Crimea or any of the infrastructure, the facilities in that place will be viewed as an attack on Russia itself. So what it currently is doing is a manifestation of the kind of threats that Putin has been making since February, when it said that any kind of attack on Russian territory would involve a response that encompasses every kind of response available as they deem proportional to as a response to that. So the indiscriminate attacks on shopping centers, civilian populated areas, is Russia's own way of responding to the attack on what Ukraine actually see, or what Russia actually sees as its own territory, rather. So I think it's an escalation, and if we keep seeing much more attacks on in areas that Russia claims that's its territory, we're going to be seeing an escalation in different methods, and to the point that we're even talking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons.
Well, Russia has said that that's a rhetoric by the West. They never said that. But we've also seen Russia threaten an escalation based on the West's support to Ukraine, especially with air weapons. Also, if we look at the role of the international community with this, the UN says, this behavior by Putin is shocking, and the UN has said it could be a war crime. But these are words, because we also know there have been several, investigation into the Bucha massacre. Are these all words, no action?
Yeah, there's no person who is adequately informed about how international politics or international law operates that would actually think that Putin will be tried for war crimes, because in the first place you have the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over its member nations. Russia, Ukraine, and many countries of the West, including Israel in the Middle East, are not signatories. They've been very ambivalent to the International Criminal Court, and you could see where this thing is going. Basically, that any mention of persecution by International Criminal Courts, not just for Putin himself, who of course it's a big target. You're talking about mid-level or junior officers in the Russian army who have been indicted for war crimes would ever get on that tribunal. It simply is not going to happen. So on the other scale, how that could happen is a resolution passed by the United Nations Security Council recommending that the International Criminal Court prosecutes nationals of countries that are not signatories to the Rome Statute that created the ICC in 2002. But if you take this matter to the to the United Nations Security Council, you're sure as hell going to meet a brick wall, because the matter is simply not going to fly. It's simply going to be hindered by a veto which the Russians still hold as a permanent member of the Security Council. So there, for now, or even ever, I don't really see a realistic chance of getting Putin or even Russian serving army officers getting indicted or even prosecuted for war crimes. But it doesn't actually stop the investigations in that regard from going forward. Some other investigators have found evidence, while the Russians are claiming that some of the attacks or the bodies they found in places like Bucha and some other parts are not necessarily actions carried out by the Russians themselves, but by the Ukrainians, who, of course, left their prisoners, their soldiers dead, and then the Russians had to take them up, dig holes, and bury them. But on the other hand, you could see the duplicity that happens in the politics of prosecution of war crimes, because a top United Nations human rights official had to resign as recently as 3 months ago because of disagreements with the president's office in Ukraine, simply because that she raised objection because of how the Ukrainian army targets indiscriminately children's centers and civilian population in their attacks or in their campaign. And so it was quite inconsistent with what the Ukrainians believe, because they felt that it was a due focus on their own actions, especially as the Russians bear a large responsibility for the blame. So she had to resign to appease President Zelensky and Kyiv in general. So on one hand, if you're talking about war crimes trial for the Russians, we should also be looking at this thing holistically to bring truth to what's happening on both sides of the divide.
And talking about today's news, the Russian Secret Service, FSB, saying that they have arrested 8 detainees in connection with that bridge explosion, and the Americans, Ukrainians, and also Russians. It will be interesting to see how that unfolds in the coming days. But the G7 nation, they're going ahead. They're supporting Ukraine all the way. But are they really giving the country enough support that it needs to fight or win this war?
Yeah, in their meeting this week, they said they're going to continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes. I would want to draw attention to that particular caveat, as long as it takes, because before the attacks took place at the end of last year's winter. So many people had expected that by the time it gets into the thick of the 2022 winter, that freezing conditions are going to force many governments to scale back their support for Ukraine. Well, for the past few weeks, we haven't seen that happen. Rather, we've seen many countries step up support, to the point that NATO is now talking about sending air defense systems to Ukraine. And so the press release by the G7 countries, that's its communique, not especially states what it means by overwhelming support, apart from what we now understand that it's a moral support, and then within the NATO framework of delivering high precision weapons and missile defense system, or air defense systems rather, which of course the Israelis have refused to provide because they do not want to upset Israel's relations with Russia and their involvement in the war in total. So yeah, it's not exactly clear, but I do think that in terms of material support, it's becoming more from the individual side of these Western countries, much more than under the cover of G7.
And what's your take in Belarus's role, in this conflict at the moment? It says it doesn't want to join the war, but is warning against provocations.
Yeah, if you recall, at the start of the war, it's Russia's attack from the west. I think that's eastern Ukraine rather came from northeastern Ukraine came from Belarus. Belarus has been subjected to sanctions on because of its provision of its territory for Russia to use to attack Ukraine. So what that plan was in February, as of then, was that since Belarus is a lot more closer to Kiev, by geography, it's going to provide an important this thing. It is going to provide an important decoy in terms of the movement of a significant amount of Russian troops. Where the Ukrainian defense is going to be heavily focused on defending Kiev. Meanwhile, the Russians are concentrating their larger, capable, and much more capable fighting force in the southern areas of Kherson, Mariupol, and Odessa. So Belarus has come under sanctions, and given the pace at which the war is going, many people are saying that although Belarus is not actively saying that it is going to provide any sort of cover for increased Russian participation, but that quite hasn't stopped it from actually, in a manner of speaking, it hasn't come out directly to come and condemn Putin or for his actions, and it has always said that it is more than ready to defend itself, and that kind of defense in terms of its posture, and it's in a manner of speaking, is quite offensive to not just Ukraine, but also to Poland, which is also by extension its neighbor. So it is in Belarus right now, the current president and his military advisors are looking at any kind of attack with nervousness, and then they're saying they're going to respond.
Well, we'll see how these things play out in the coming days. We appreciate your time always on the program. Confidence Makari, Foreign Affairs commentator. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me once again.
Well, while a new liquefied natural gas project off Africa's western coast may only be 80% complete, but already the prospect of new energy supply has drawn visits from leaders of Poland and Germany. The initial field near Senegal, Mauritania's coastline, is expected to contain about 15 trillion cubic feet of gas, 5 times more than what gas-dependent Germany used in all of 2019. But production isn't expected to start until the end of next year. However, President Vladimir Putin has said that gas could still be supplied by one remaining intact part of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But the ball was now in the European Union's court on whether or not it wanted gas supplied through it. Putin also said that one line of Nord Stream 2 pipeline is likely to remain functional as it maintains pressure. Meanwhile, Dutch Energy Minister said there wasn't any current intelligence leading him to think oil leak at the Druzhba pipeline was an act of sabotage. Rob Jetten made the comments as he attended Prague's EU summit on energy. A leak in Poland on the pipeline from Russia reduced the flow of oil to Germany. The operator of the pipeline in Poland said this. Polish refineries were unaffected. The Polish government said the leak was probably caused by an accident.
Well, obviously, the whole of Europe is very concerned about our vital infrastructure, and we take close care of our infrastructure as much as possible. We've seen some dramatic events at Nord Stream over the past few weeks, so every other infrastructure that gets damaged has our full attention, and we look forward to get more analysis from our Polish colleagues on that.
Has there been anything revealed actually so far about the cause?
No, not yet. As far as I know, there is no direct intel that there is sabotage, just like that happened at Nord Stream. But I think it's important to look into it into full details to make sure that this wasn't any sabotage on European soil. All EU member states are looking for ways to lower prices on the European energy market without endangering the security of supply for Europe. There are different circumstances in countries in European regions, but we actually agree on some non-regret measures that can be taken.
We'll also bring you more on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. More stories there, but still to come. Welcome back. Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan arrived in the Kazakh capital Astana today ahead of talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Erdogan and Putin are expected to meet tomorrow on the sidelines of a regional summit to discuss Ukraine and bilateral relations. Kremlin spokesman has previously told reporters it was possible the two leaders will discuss a Turkish proposal to host talks between Russia and the West on peace in Ukraine. Erdogan, who was welcomed in Astana with an official ceremony by the Kazakh president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. The leaders will be attending the conference on interaction and confidence-building measures in Asia. Russian president has said that the situation around Ukraine's Russian-held Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is of concern. Speaking at a meeting in St. Petersburg, Putin told International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA head Rafael Grossi that Russia was open for dialogue and would discuss all issues concerning the facility's operations. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, has been a key flashpoint in Russia's nearly 8-month military campaign in Ukraine.
Of course, we observe the elements of excessive and dangerous politicization of everything connected with atomic activity. We do hope very much that thanks to your efforts, too, we will be able to calm down all this rhetoric and to normalize this sphere of activity and cooperation despite turbulent and complicated processes currently underway on the world scene. We are very happy to see you and will be delighted to discuss all the issues of our mutual interest, and which are probably even of concern to some and to us. For instance, it is everything connected with the situation around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In any case, we are open to this dialogue and happy to see you.
And so far, State Emergency Services of Ukraine released a video showing the moment emergency workers rescued a family from the rubble of a destroyed building in Zaporizhzhia. Russian missiles hit the southern city in the early hours of Monday, killing at least one person. Regional official Alexander Starok said that more people may remain under the rubble as the search and rescue operation continues. The president ordered the attack, talking about Russian president now, saying that it was to avenge a blast that damaged Russia's bridge to occupied Crimea. Pope Francis has condemned Russia's relentless bombings of Ukrainian cities, saying the attacks had unleashed a hurricane of violence on residents. Speaking to thousands of people at his weekly general audience in St. Peter's Square, he also appealed to those who have the fate of the war in their hands to stop. Pope Francis says his heart is always with the Ukrainian people, especially the residents of the places that have been hit by relentless bombings. At least 26 people have been killed across the country in Moscow's biggest aerial offensive since the start of the invasion.
La pace sia con voi.
And similarly, in Kherson, a Ukrainian serviceman in the ranks of the Territorial Defense Forces published a Facebook video Tuesday showing the Ukrainian flag being raised over a retaken town in the Kherson region. Soldier Max Track from a large industrial city 50 kilometers north of the Akhanelsk said that his city's 29th separate brigade of the Territorial Defense Forces, together with other forces, had retaken the town at the strategically important settlement in Ulet River. President Volodymyr Zelensky said October 2nd that Ukrainian forces have liberated the small settlements of that area and also Miloyovka in the Kherson region. In the latest reports from the battlefield, Ukraine's military said its forces drove Russian troops out of several settlements on the west bank of the Dnipro River near the Russian-occupied town of Berislav in the Kherson region. Happy foreign tourists flock to Tokyo's Asakusa district as Japan reopens its borders. That's coming up next. We continue first with Britain, where Business Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg has said that economic figures are not always accurate, as data show the country's economy is on the brink of recession. The UK's economy unexpectedly shrank in August as weakness in manufacturing and maintenance work and North Sea oil and gas fields contributed to a 0.3% fall in gross domestic product from July. During an interview, Rees-Mogg said figures on the day are an ounce of economic growth or otherwise. He says they can't be entirely relied on. They are highly subject to change. British Prime Minister Liz Truss, who took office at the beginning of September, has vowed to reignite economic growth by reforming planning rules, workers' rights, immigration, while cutting tens of billions of pounds of taxes. Rees-Mogg defended the government's fiscal policy, suggesting growth is everything and would help the country reduce its debt to GDP ratio.
The economy has grown rather than shrunk. So figures on the day they're announced. There's a couple of things. First of all, the ONS recently updated earlier figures in the year to show that the economy had grown rather than shrunk. So figures on the day they're announced of economic growth or otherwise can't be entirely relied on. They're highly subject to change. But if they can be relied on, then clearly it was right of the Chancellor to provide a modest fiscal stimulus to try and ensure that we don't have a shrinking economy. So I think this ties in with what the Chancellor was doing and moving away from the highest tax rates in 70 years, moving away from the risk outlined by the Governor of the Bank of England early in the summer of 5 quarters of recession. I think he used the word Armageddon. That moving away from that is something that the government has to try and work on. We couldn't simply have sat back and allowed economic circumstances to deteriorate. Well, I'm trying to contextualise the number and remind people that these numbers are very often revised. And yesterday, the IMF, which isn't always enormously sympathetic to His Majesty's government, said that the UK economy would grow next year. I'm as suspicious of forecasts as I am of the latest release of figures which are subject to review, but nonetheless, some people are becoming more optimistic about the UK economy, and this obviously ties in with what the Chancellor did to help ensure that we are restored to growth. And growth is everything, because if you can get 2.5% growth, then you can pay for the interventions that have been made easily, then you have the money to pay for public services that you need, and you ensure that the debt to GDP falls. So the government is absolutely right to have a strategy focused on economic growth. Actually, I think in reality it's about monetary policy and interest rate differentials, and I think that the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates faster than anybody else has had a fundamental effect and has sucked money into the United States.
Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Liz Truss has said she would not cut public spending after her government came under pressure to fund vast tax cuts that have roiled markets and sparked alarm over government finances. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, IFS, said this week that the government needed to find £62 billion of spending cuts or tax rises to stop the public debt growing. She was asked at her weekly parliamentary questions if she was still committed to a pledge she made during the Conservative Party leadership contest that she was not planning public spending cuts. She also said the government would proceed with a planned law to override some post-Brexit trade rules for Northern Ireland if a negotiated settlement could not be reached with the European Union.
Talking about 6 months. We've also taken decisive action to make sure that we are not facing the highest taxes for 70 years in the face of a global economic slowdown. And what we're making sure is that we protect our economy at this very difficult time.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, the Business Secretary toured the TV studios arguing that the turmoil in the markets has nothing to do with her budget. Does the Prime Minister agree with him?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we have done is we have taken decisive action. We have taken decisive action to make sure that people are not facing energy bills of £6,000 for 2 years. And I think we remember the opposition is only talking about 6 months. We've also taken decisive action to make sure that we are not facing the highest taxes for 70 years in the face of a global economic slowdown. And what we're making sure is that we protect our economy at this very difficult time internationally. And as a result of our action, Mr. Speaker, and this has been independently corroborated, we will see higher growth and lower inflation.
There's no point trying to hide it. Everyone can see what has happened. The Tories went on a borrowing spree, sending mortgage rates through the roof. They are skyrocketing by £500 a month. And for nearly 2 million homeowners, their fixed rate deals are coming to an end next year. They're worried sick, and everybody in this House knows it. They won't forgive. They won't forget, and nor should they. When will she stop ducking responsibility, do the right thing, and reverse her kamikaze budget, which is causing so much pain?
Mr. Speaker, last night the Labour Party supported bringing down national insurance. And is he really?
I want to hear the Prime Minister. I'm sorry if her own party doesn't, but I certainly do.
Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely unclear about what
A preview of the Prime Minister's weekly parliamentary questions. Our London correspondent Simon Pusey joins me now for more. Hi Simon, it's good to see you. Liz Truss has defended her budget in the face of global economic slowdown. Give us an idea with what the UK's economy is facing now.
Yeah, the economy's not in great shape, and I think you heard the response there to Liz Truss's answers that kind of made its own story, really told its own story. Not many of her backbenchers really backing her today in Prime Minister's questions, because since that mini budget a couple of weeks ago, the economy has been crashing. The pound, I think we've been reporting it here quite a lot, has absolutely been tanking. It looks like we are in a recession. A lot of people thinking we probably are already in a recession. And recently some data out that Britain's economy shrank by 0.3% in August from July. That's new data that was released today. And that's a big surprise that it shrank by that much. We thought it would only shrink by 0.1%. The decline in GDP also 0.3% over the next 3 months. So nothing really going the way of the government in terms of that mini budget. Nothing seems to have worked there. The global bank here, the Bank of England has come in and bought some bonds, which has helped a little bit. But a lot of people thinking the Chancellor won't have a job in a couple of weeks' time, based on what we've seen since he's come into power, since he's become Chancellor.
But is it true that investors have lost confidence in the government? And this is, according to Keir Starmer's, point of view, is the Prime Minister's game shifting?
Yeah, new research, again, recently from HYCM has found that the majority of UK investors do lack faith in the British government's ability to rebuild the economy. Remember, the Conservative Party here, they are supposed to be the fiscally responsible party. That's what they always talk about, that Labour are just going to spend, spend, spend and borrow, borrow, borrow. Well, actually, things seem to have reversed recently. Investors really like stability, don't they? They don't like to see the pound crashing or markets all over the place. They love stability. So I think investors would much rather have seen the UK government maybe cutting a few taxes, taxing a little bit more and cutting a bit of public spending to try and pay back some of this huge debt that we've got ourselves into over the pandemic, as opposed to these unfunded tax cuts and lots of borrowing, which we don't know where we're getting the money from. I think that has really spooked investors. So I think Sir Keir Starmer does have a point there, that investors probably at the moment don't trust what the government is doing fiscally.
But is it clear what the Labour Party wants if they're not in favour of, you know, the mini budget and what Liz Truss is trying to put together?
Yeah, well, they initially said actually that the government should be capping energy prices. And it took the government a long time. Now, people would say that's because Boris Johnson was leaving office. He didn't want to step on his predecessor, the person coming in, on their toes. But for a long time, Labour was saying cap energy prices. And then the Conservatives, the government, went and capped energy prices. And so it looked like they're sort of leaping on a Labour policy there. They wanted, really, for the budget, they want, you know, working people to be able to have a bit of more money in their pockets. They don't want things like bankers' bonuses to go up, you know, and Liz Truss is pointing to trickle-down economics there. But they criticise the government's refusal to tax the energy giants. A couple of energy companies said, yeah, tax us a little bit if it helps. You know, go for it. We've got record profits up tenfold. Why don't you tax us a bit? Well, the government said, no, we're not going to do that. So it just gives the kind of indication that really they're not on the side of working people. They're slightly, you know, more in terms of the rich and wealthy, giving them tax breaks and not really. So that's where Labour are saying. They're saying, why are you not taxing the energy giants that are making record profits and giving it back to the people in things like maybe some tax cuts or maybe some more public spending somewhere.
And Simon, what's the pulse of the average Briton on these economic issues? And then, of course, Labour and the Prime Minister's?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the average Brit probably doesn't watch Prime Minister's questions that closely, but they'll be aware of what the mood is and they'll be aware of what the criticism is surrounding policies. And I think that the messages really that are coming out at the moment are that the governments are not really on the side of people who are working and people that are hard up and struggling to pay their mortgages, struggling to pay their heating bills. When, you know, they're seeing that some of the policies that are being implemented are that the banker's bonus cap has been scrapped, that corporation tax, you know, which taxes some of the biggest companies, is down. So a lot of the biggest companies are getting tax breaks. So I think probably most people are looking at the government. And also remember, the Conservatives are supposed to be the fiscally responsible ones, and they've just tanked the pound. So what they often point to is, vote for us, we'll get a strong, healthy economy, and everyone will be better off. And they claim usually that the Labour Party are the ones that spend, 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 and then they leave the country in a terrible state. Well, at the moment, with the pound really struggling and the markets all over the place, they can't really claim to be fiscally responsible. And I think that's where they're struggling at the moment. I think that's where people, when they go to the voting booths, whenever that may be, it's why Labour have a big lead in the polls at the moment. It's because the one thing the Conservatives can usually be good at, or appear to be good at, is the economy. And at the moment, they're not being good at that.
Indeed, and also, according to the IMF's projections, you know, next year, the future isn't looking good either. Simon, thank you. Our London correspondent, Simon Pusey, there for us.
Thank you.
Let's go over to South Korea, where the central bank today raised interest rates by 0.5 percentage points and flagged more policy tightening as authorities scrambled to hose down red-hot inflation, caused in large part by a surging US dollar and higher import prices. The Bank of Korea, BOK, raised its benchmark policy rate by 50 basis points to 3% on Wednesday, bringing total rates hikes since August last year to 250 basis points. The U.S. Federal Reserve's 375 basis point hikes have propelled a dollar rally against most other currencies, forcing policymakers around the world to review the risk of fresh inflation pressure and capital outflows. The BOK said it sees upside risks to its August inflation projection for the year at 5.2%, which warrants continued rate hikes. The won's 17% slump this year could fuel consumer price gains by making imports more expensive. And still in Asia, we go to space, where the Japanese space agency's Epsilon rocket failed after it was launched today and was destroyed. Kyodo News Agency and other domestic media reported footage filmed by a town official in Kimotsuki, where the launch took place. A crowd of spectators could be seen watching and filming the rocket's launch from an observation site near the Ihi spaceport Uchinohara in Kagoshima at around 9:54 a.m. local time. The Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, sent a destruction order signal to the rocket after detecting trouble. Public broadcaster NHK said the signal was sent after the JAXA determined that the rocket was not able to fly safely. It was the first failure of a major Japanese rocket launch since 2003 and the first of Epsilon's series of rockets. And to health. Happy foreign tourists flocked to Tokyo's Asakusa district as Japan reopened its borders amid a fall in the yen against the dollar, bringing it to its weakest level since 1998. The dollar strengthened 0.3% to 146.30 yen in Asian trading today, after pushing as high as 146.35, a level not seen since August 1998. Nakasimisi Street, which leads to Asakusa's Senzoji Temple, a hotspot for visitors to Tokyo, was showing signs of the COVID-19 pandemic's impact, with many shops alongside those that sold postcards, snacks, souvenirs still shuttered. But the weak yen could boost tourist spending, which is good news for businesses that managed to weather the storm. Knife maker Manobu Hirano said he hoped to return to mass tourism from overseas, that it will boost his business.
It's like every store is having a 35% off sale. You know, we go into a place and we're used to having the yen to dollar be about 100 to 1. And so we're used to looking at a price, dividing by 100, which is very easy. And my wife and I go into the store and we'll look at it and go, oh, this is $50. And I got to remember, no, it's actually $30 now, which is, a big difference.
We've definitely splashed out on the Shinkansen, because it's so cost prohibitive normally. It's so expensive, and we've just been taking it everywhere. So so we've seen a lot more of Japan this visit, and it's because the prices are so cheap. Yeah.
Coming up on the program. Spain marks National Day with military parade. We have details in a moment. We take you to Thailand now, where there will be psychological evaluations for anyone trying to buy a gun, and a sweep for drug addicts will be launched. This is according to the Prime Minister under tighter rules in response to a massacre centered on a nursery. The rules are among a raft of measures introduced by the government since a former policeman who was discharged for drugs went on a knife and gun rampage last week, killing a total of 37 people, including 24 children and himself. The government is also looking to hold periodical evaluations on both active and retired government officials who carry weapons, in particular those that show signs of being a danger to society. Prayuth, Interior Minister, also ordered the police and other officials to spend 3 months to identify drug addicts and get them into rehabilitation. Meanwhile, mental health officers are assisting distraught relatives of the mass shooting victims in Thailand, helping them to come to terms with their loss ahead of a mass cremation ceremony last night. Health advice, breathing exercises, medication were dispensed by the workers from tents set up near the cremation venue in northeastern Non Bua Lamphu province. With emotions expected to run higher than usual during the mass cremation, officers were assigned to each family to help them cope. We come to the continent of Africa, where in the last 2 months, cholera cases in Malawi have tripled as authorities struggle to contain an outbreak. So far, the disease has killed more than 117 people in the country. The United Nations says that cases across the country have jumped from 1,000 to more than 4,200 since August. The first case of cholera, which spreads mainly through contaminated food and water, was reported in March in southern Malawi, but the disease has now spread to 22 of Malawi's 28 districts. Experts have warned that the situation could be worsened by the onset of rainy season in November. Data from the World Health Organization shows that this is the worst outbreak so far this year globally. The United States has returned 23 looted artifacts to Nigeria. The Benin bronzes were handed over to a Nigerian delegation at a ceremony on Tuesday in Washington. Nigeria's Minister of Information and Culture, Mr. Lai Mohammed, who received the artifacts, hailed the U.S. and its institutions for the repatriation of the highly cherished cultural artworks. The Information Ministry says the returned artifacts comprise 21 from the Smithsonian and 1 each from the National Gallery of Art and the Rhode Island School of Design. The repatriation is part of a bilateral cultural property agreement to prevent illegal imports into the U.S. of some categories of Nigerian artifacts. The items are among thousands of artworks known as Benin bronzes, stolen from the Benin Kingdom in present-day Nigeria by British colonialists in 1897. The items were then distributed to various museums and institutions across Europe and the U.S. Nigeria is set to receive more such artifacts from the Netherlands, the UK and Germany. Still on the continent, Africa barely contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions, yet it is paying an outsized price. This according to United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who made this known during a meeting marking the 20th anniversary of the African Union, AU. He told the Security Council that the world is heading straight off a climate cliff, and for many Africans, this is not a distant threat, but a daily reality.
We are heading straight off a climate cliff. For many Africans, this is not a distant threat, but a daily reality. Africa barely contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions, yet it is paying an outsized price. This is a textbook case of moral and economic injustice. In the Horn of Africa, for example, people are facing the threat of famine after 4 consecutive failed rainy seasons, a first in over 40 years. In the Sahel, drought and land degradation are exacerbating tensions between farmers and herders. At the same time, communities in southern Africa face hurricanes and flash floods. Le recours à la force est trop souvent considéré comme la seule méthode de résolution de différends. Les changements inconstitutionnels de gouvernement se multiplient. Au Sahel, Daesh et les affiliés d'Al-Qaïda perpétuent leurs funestes attaques et cherchent à étendre leur emprise. Dans le corne de l'Afrique, en Éthiopie, dans l'Est de la République démocratique du Congo, au Mali, au Soudan et en Libye,
The UN General Assembly has elected South Africa, Algeria, Bangladesh, Belgium, Chile, Costa Rica, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Maldives, Morocco, Romania and Vietnam to the Human Rights Council for a 3-year term starting January 1, 2023. Germany and Sudan also won second terms on the Geneva-based body, but South Korea and Venezuela failed to be re-elected. The 47-member council cannot make legally binding decisions, but its decisions carry political weight, and it can authorize inquiries. Candidates are elected in geographical groups. There were 2 competitive races among the Asia-Pacific and Latin American and Caribbean states to elect 14 members. Members cannot serve more than 2 consecutive terms. Along with South Korea and Venezuela, Afghanistan also failed to win a seat. Observers say the election was important since it could tip the power balance within a deeply divided council. Vote counts have been getting closer on key issues, and last week, a Western-led coalition lost a call for a debate on acquisitions of Chinese abuses in Xinjiang. This is by just 2 votes in a historic defeat.
The following 14 states have thus been elected members of the Human Rights Council for the 3-year term of the office beginning of 1st of January 2023. Algeria, Bangladesh, Belgium, Chile, Costa Rica, Georgia, Germany, Kyrgyzstan, Maldives, Morocco, Romania, South Africa, Sudan, and Vietnam. The General Assembly will consider sub-item C of agenda item 117 for the election of 14 members of the Human Rights Council to replace those members whose term of office expires on 31st of December 2022.
Finally on the program, Spanish royals presiding over a military parade in Madrid to mark the country's National Day. After the last editions were marked by coronavirus restrictions, 4,000 members of military corps, 150 vehicles, 84 aircraft participated in this year's edition. A 54-meter Spanish flag was displayed in the air as 2 parachuters flew down and landed in front of King Felipe and Queen Letizia. Most of the cabinet, regional chiefs, members of parliament attended the ceremony where Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez received whistles and complaints from people. And that's our program this evening. Thank you for watching. I'm Melissa.